Over the past year or so, SBI has been consistently making changes to the game that affect solo dungeons, making them able to be done much more safely. In fact, today, you can go out and do tier 8 solo dungeons in the Black Zone with virtually no risk. If you pop a solo dungeon map in a Black Zone portal town, it will spawn in one of the zones adjacent to that town. You can then take the invisibility shrine and walk out to that zone and go to your solo dungeon while being invincible and invulnerable the entire time. After you enter the solo dungeon, you can wait 90 seconds at the start, and the solo dungeon will close behind you, making it literally impossible for anyone to dive you, allowing you to clear the solo dungeon in peace. Once it's done and you leave the solo dungeon, there's no need to run back to the portal city. Instead, you can just use the journey back feature to teleport back right then and there, leaving you with a cleared solo dungeon map and virtually no chance for anyone to find and gank you. Does this make solo dungeons completely overpowered? Well, that's what I'm going to explore in this video. Now, I just outlined how solo dungeons can be done with relative safety if you take the right precautions and steps to protect yourself. The problem is, those precautions and steps that you do to increase your safety have a cost. The 90 seconds of wait time at the start of a solo dungeon to make sure you don't get dove, for example, may not seem like a big deal, but those 90 seconds are very significant. You know the expression time is money? Well, it's very real here. Every 90 seconds you spend at the start of a solo dungeon is 90 seconds that you're not spending clearing the dungeon, getting fame, and making money. And it's not just like you're making less money by waiting. No, you're making significantly less money by waiting, because solo dungeons really aren't that long. The average solo dungeon is around 1.6 floors, and those floors can be really short. If you are clearing dungeons efficiently, hitting an average clear time of say 6 minutes per dungeon is not too difficult or uncommon. Meaning if you spend 90 seconds waiting to be safe at the start of every one, and you're clearing dungeons at an average of 6 minutes, you're going to be clearing 25% slower. That means 25% less fame and 25% less money. That is a very significant price to pay. The other expensive cost for safety is in the Journey Back feature. Now, this is a little simpler. It costs money to use Journey Back. So if you want to reduce the risk of getting ganked running back to town by using Journey Back, it will directly cut from your silver profits. And to make things sting just a little more, if you got a lot of loot from the dungeon, that Journey Back is going to be even more expensive. The cost of Journey Back scales with how much stuff you have on you, so if you get a legendary chest with lots of loot, expect a hefty price tag on that journey back. Now, all of this said about the cost of safety, that doesn't necessarily make this bad. While waiting 90 seconds at the start of a dungeon and journeying back does cut into your profits and gains from doing solos, it does make them safe, meaning you're able to keep the silver you make while doing them. But that's not entirely true either, because solos aren't actually as safe as they seem, even if you take the safe steps and precautions. While SBI did change a lot about the game that made solo dungeons safer to do, they also did some things that make them more dangerous, and there's a good chance you didn't even realize. First is the butterfly effect. Not the actual butterfly effect, it just sounds cool to say, but rather the introduction of those little colored butterflies that appear on enchanted solo dungeons. These butterflies indicate to anybody outside that the dungeon is enchanted. Now, problem is, every dungeon map is enchanted by nature, and so if you pop a map, it will have the butterflies. This is very unhelpful to you because it signals to everybody outside your dungeon that there might be somebody in there, and it might be worth checking out. Especially if you do anything above flat maps, giving more colorful and more attractive butterflies for aggressive players to check out. Now, you may think that this doesn't really matter because you can just wait the 90 seconds to make sure you don't get dove, but it does matter because there is time in between when your bubble wears off from you entering and the time you get a new one, making it so that if someone enters at the wrong time, you have to tank them until you get a new bubble, meaning you can definitely still die. And this problem is greatly amplified against groups. So now, if you're a ganker or someone who is going to or wants to dive solo dungeons, you no longer have to check every solo dungeon. Instead, you have a nice little visual indication of the solo dungeons that are likely to have players in them. And since lots of players will be doing solo dungeons in the same zones, like the ones right around Black Zone towns, they become hotspots for people to check solo dungeons. So what you end up with is, if you want to do solo dungeons in a convenient spot, well, chances are if you don't wait the 90 seconds, you're gonna get dove pretty consistently, and if you do wait the 90 seconds, you still might not be safe, as you're probably gonna have a fair amount of people coming to check on you while you're waiting. Along with this, something that amplifies this problem is that Albion has always had a simple rule: don't let anybody see you enter your dungeon. It's just simple common sense, because if someone sees you enter your dungeon, you're gonna get dove. But how are you supposed to not let people see you enter your dungeon when you can't see other people? If you take invis out of the city, it will break while you're channeling into your solo dungeon, and there's almost guaranteed to be people invisible all over the zone, because you basically have to take invis out of the towns if you don't want to get ganked. Meaning, there's a really good chance that people are going to see you enter your solo dungeon without you ever knowing. So even if you take all the necessary precautions to make yourself as safe as possible, it's still really not all that safe. For Black Zone activity, it's still pretty safe compared to other ones, but if you get a little bit unlucky, you're still just gonna die. Now, I just went over the cost and illusion of safety, assuming that you do the method that I outlined in the intro of doing solos out of a Black Zone portal town, but clearly that's not the best option. In fact, you can pretty much eliminate the risk of getting dove if you just do solo dungeons deeper into the Black Zone, where there will be less people around. If you're in a guild with a Black Zone hideout, for example, you can do your solo dungeons from there, making the risk of getting dove basically zero. But unfortunately, if you do that, you lose the other aspect of your safety in the invisibility shrines, letting you get to your dungeon undetected. In fact, solo dungeons from your hideout are likely to be a lot more dangerous, because when you pop a solo dungeon map, it will usually spawn one zone away from you. If you're in the Black Zone portal town, that means right outside the town. But if you're doing them from your hideout, since you can't pop a map from inside a hideout, you have to leave your hideout and then pop the map, travel to the next zone over without any invisibility buff, and risk getting ganked. And then after you do that dungeon, if you want to do another one, you either risk getting pushed into yet another zone out away from your hideout, or having to journey back or run back to your hideout and reset the entire process. Basically, doing solo dungeons out of a hideout will ping pong you around the Black Zone, going from dungeon to dungeon, map to map, making it highly likely you will run into gankers sooner or later. Of course, you could always just not do maps, instead going for the randomly spawning dungeons around your zone, but this is not ideal, as maps give significantly better rewards, especially if you aren't able to access a tier 8 zone for solo dungeons. But all of that barely even matters, because that's not even the worst part. The worst part is that you somehow need to get all of your loot back to the Royal Continent to sell on the markets, meaning if you get unlucky on that trip back, you can just straight up lose all of the money you made. Really, the best option for doing solos is to go to one of the Black Zone rest towns that lie deeper into the Black Zone and do them from that rest town, similar to how you would do them from the portal town. It carries the exact same risks as the portal town, but just to a lesser degree, as there will be less people in the rest towns than portal towns. However, because of those less people, it also does have the downside of a less reliable market, meaning you still will likely have to transport some loot back to the royal markets, or take a heavy loss on some items. In my opinion, it's definitely the best option, barring a hideout in a tier 8 zone, but still doesn't feel that good. Now, I just talked a lot about the risks and downsides to doing solo dungeons, but that doesn't necessarily make them bad. If you were to make, say, 10 mil an hour doing solo dungeons, you would definitely still do them, even with all the downsides, because it would still be worth it. So how good are the rewards actually for solo dungeons? Well, that's a surprisingly difficult question to answer. This may surprise you, but objectively, solo dungeon rewards actually aren't too bad. In my recent testing of solo dungeons, I've made a little under 2 mil an hour, which is my sort of mark as a decent money-making activity. Similarly, the fame is pretty good, clocking in around 1.5 to 1.8 mil an hour. Now, to caveat this, these numbers will change a lot depending on person, build, IP, specialization, dungeon tier, etc, etc. I was doing flat tier 8 dungeon maps with around 1350 IP, and I was doing this with the fastest clearing sets possible in the game, not taking any safety precautions and just speedrunning them as fast as possible. And it's important to mention I have done a ton of solo dungeons in the past, so I'm very experienced at making them as efficient as possible. This means that those numbers are top end solo dungeon rewards. You're probably not going to hit much higher than the 2 mil an hour mark for fame or money. And in fact, most people will likely hit significantly below this, especially at lower tiers. But that being said, it still does stand that if you get good at them, you can hit around the 2 mil an hour mark, both for fame and money, objectively making the rewards pretty good. But that doesn't really matter, because even if they're objectively decent for rewards, subjectively, the rewards are awful. What do I mean by that? Well, when you go and do a solo dungeon, you don't really feel like you're getting rewarded. Let's just take the money for example. While the average money per dungeon or money per hour per chest can be decent, the median loot sucks. It's genuinely terrible. If you go into any given solo dungeon and open a chest, you're most likely to receive 5 to 50k worth of loot, and this includes maps. In fact, when I was testing flat tier 8 solo dungeon maps, it was incredibly common for me to clear one of those maps and come out with less money than the map was worth in the first place. On average, I was making 2 mil an hour with those maps, but the majority of them barely even paid for themselves. That doesn't feel good, or make people want to do solo dungeons. That makes the rewards feel really bad. Now, just to explain this a little bit for those who don't understand how this works, basically when you open a chest in Albion, you're usually not getting the average rewards. The most common result is the low end of the reward spectrum. If, say, the average chest gives you 100k worth of loot, if you open 100 chests, you will end up with 10 mil. But the amount of loot in every individual chest is going to vary heavily. In fact, most of the chests will give you like 10 to 50k worth of loot, which isn't even half of what the average chest gives. The reason that the average is so much higher than what you usually get is because 1 in every 10 chests or so you might get a purple chest that gives 400k loot, and 1 in every 50 chests you'll hit a legendary chest that gives 1 million in loot. These higher tier chests, while quite rare, really spike up that average. So what you end up with is a system that makes lower reward activities like solo dungeon feel awful, even if they aren't, because when you go to open a chest, you're usually going to find complete garbage inside. So how good are the solo dungeon rewards? Well, there's not a clean answer. Objectively, at the higher tiers, they can be pretty decent, but subjectively, they don't feel good, because most of the chests are garbage. Okay, so I ranted for a really long time about a bunch of random stuff in this video, but all we really care about is the conclusion. Are solo dungeons worth doing? At the end of the day, how good are they? Well, for the sake of argument, I'm going to assume that you either have a really good hideout location for doing solo dungeons, or you're doing them from one of the rest towns, because those are the really only viable options, in my opinion. Now, the one thing that I can say confidently is that the rewards for solo dungeons aren't quite good enough to pay for the cost of safety. If you're going to wait for 90 seconds at the start of every solo dungeon to make sure you don't get dove, and use journey back every time to avoid gankers, it's not worth it. It would cut too much out of your profits to the point where you'd just be better off doing something else. If you scrap the safety precautions though, and you take a cheap clearing set and do some higher tier maps like 7s or 8s, it probably is worth it, because it can be decent for money and fame and is still decently safe for a black zone activity. Definitely not top tier, but okay and probably worth doing. You will though have to accept that 1, you're probably going to die from a diver or a gank group at least once while you're doing them, and 2, you have to trust the process. It's not going to feel good because a lot of the chests are going to be giving you some hot garbage instead of any good loot. meaning you'll probably feel like you're making a lot less money than you actually are. When it comes to lower tier solo dungeons and safe zone solo dungeons, that's a lot harder, partly because I haven't tested them as much and partly because you need something to compare them to. I will say that if your primary focus is to progress your account and get fame, you're basically always better off doing open world mobs. For solo dungeons, fame is more of a bonus secondary reward, especially at lower tiers. If you're looking to make money though, well, it's still not great. Lower tier solo dungeons feel even worse than the higher tier ones, as most chests just cop up pennies, and even objectively the money per hour really isn't great. But there's also not much to compare them to, as money making for newer players that isn't market based is heavily lacking. So they're not good for money, but it's hard to find something else to suggest as a replacement, so in some ways low tier solo dungeons are one of the better ways to make money for a new player, even though they're shit, because there's just nothing else out there. Really, if you're a newer player that can't reasonably go for the higher tier Black Zone solo dungeons yet, my suggestion would be to try them out and see if you enjoy doing them, because if you do, then they're probably worth doing, but if you don't, just avoid them for now and separate the account progression and money making parts of your gameplay. So taking that all together, at the right time with the right setup, solo dungeons can be worth it, but overall they aren't great, and they feel even worse than they are.